O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls, O good one.
Amen.
Okay, so Ellie had a question, which I think is actually something very useful, about getting a little bit more into the difference between the first temple and the second temple, and what happened in Israelite religion, right? And why it was so different, and what is that, and why is it different from contemporary Judaism, and how is it different? I don't know contemporary Judaism very well, but I can give a few parameters, and I think it's useful because so much of the material that we're dealing with deals precisely with the distinction between the first temple, religion of the first temple, and religion of the second temple, and that has a huge role to play. That question has a huge role to play in the teaching of Jesus. Okay, so we more or less know the narratives, right? There was Genesis is, there's the creation narrative in Noah, and then there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then at the end of Genesis, Jacob goes off to Egypt. Or Joseph, his son, goes off to Egypt, and Jacob also ends his days in Egypt. But then there's an interlude of 400 years before Exodus, which is the story of Moses and Moses' vision of God, while after Moses has grown up and attained to a substantial position, and he begins to identify with his Hebrew forebears, and he kills an Egyptian, so he goes off into a kind of self-imposed exile, has a vision of God and a calling experience, and goes back and after a series of plagues, gets Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. We all know the story, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Everybody's read Genesis and Exodus? Yeah. Not everything is necessary. We can't necessarily take it all at face value historically. And what's really important is that the fathers of the church didn't. They used it as the basis for allegory. And allegory there's nothing historical about allegory. They also used it for typology. And typology is historically based, but it doesn't necessarily it's not necessary for the events described to be literally historical in the sense of what we think of as historical. In our culture, we have an entirely different concept of history than, say, when the scriptures were being written, much less when the Old Testament was being written, or the initial. Because here our concept of history is that it's a series of events that were witnessed, and that there's corroboration for, and we know about the series of events. We can analyze the decisions and of the various players that went into all of the various happenings. We can pull apart, why the Second World War happened, or why the Russian Revolution happened, and we try to pull apart, why did Moses lead the Jews out of Egypt, you know, and all of this stuff, and try and do that in a historical, empirical manner. And in our culture, that historical empiricism is a criterion of truth. In the Old Testament, there was not a historical, empirical criterion of truth. When the Old Testament was being written, they used the language of myth. And part of that is because there were no records, there were no corroborating witnesses. You couldn't go back and analyze the documents because there were no documents. You know, if you look at the large parts of Genesis, it was dealing with the time before people could read and write. So there's no documents, you know. And so what it is, it was an oral tradition that got passed along as to what the nature of, or as to who the various actors were historically, how they were linked. In the case of the Old Testament, especially in Genesis, it was a link by blood because it's a historical line, not only from Adam, and then it gives the whole genealogy of Adam through Noah, and then from Noah on through until you get up to Abraham, who has a son Isaac, who has a son Jacob, who has 12 sons, the 12 patriarchs, and so it's an aspect of genealogy interwoven with other stories about that period, which have greater or lesser symbolic value and greater or lesser teaching value as to what the content. Did it actually happen as it was written? We can't know. We can believe that something like that happened, but there was nobody around. You know, Moses wasn't sitting there recording, 5,000 years of history. Nobody was sitting there recording 5,000 years of history. Yeah.
I just want to ask you about Father Seraphim Rose and his kind of exegesis.
That's a long story. Okay, I don't want to go into that right now. That's a long story.
Okay.
I was told I should put this in. Whoops. Airplane mode. There's also one of the biggest problems in America in dealing in a convert context is that we superimpose our categories on the text. And when Father Seraphim was writing, he was one of the first authors dealing with some of these issues in English, and it's an initial treatment, and but anyway, it's a long story. But anyway, so far as Genesis goes, you have a whole lot of mythic language, which is poetic language. It's liturgical language. The stories were composed in a certain way to be used in a certain way to be used and they were composed in a way in which there are multiple layers of meaning within the stories. It's not just historical, empirical data. There's a moral level, there's a typological level, they can be used for allegory. There is a literal historical element. There obviously, if somebody can trace their lineage back through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then most likely there was an Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because if they were your forefathers, then that memory might be preserved. But what's really important in the Genesis story is the relationship, not just of the people and the events and the entrance into Canaan and all of that, but what's important is it's all about the relationship with God. And from the very first sentence in the book of Genesis, it's all about God. So it's really not a story about human beings. There are human beings, but it's about God's relationship with the world. God is creator of the world. The relationship of the world with God, the creation of Adam and Eve as the image of God, as at the apex of creation, and the fall of Adam and Eve, and the coming of death into the world, not as a punishment, but rather as simply as the consequence of their sin. And then eventually it gets to the covenants. There's a covenant made with Moses, or rather with Noah. And then there's the covenant with Abraham. And then there's the whole story of Melchizedek in there. Hello. And with Isaac, and the relationship of Abraham and God in relation to Isaac. So it's very important to understand that Genesis is a very highly sophisticated, composed piece of literature.
The story of Abraham is tough.
It is.
I mean, difficult to invent.
Yeah, but to reduce it to historical empirical data is a radical impoverishment of the text. And it misses the whole point, because the whole point is that the main character in the story is God. Exodus, same thing. Although, its narrative is different. It's the story of Moses and of the giving of the law and things. So, and with most, and certainly with the rest of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, as well as in much of the rest of the Old Testament, you have this interplay between poetry and liturgical language and allegorical and typological implications, all of which are very important ways of dealing with and understanding the text. So last week, one of the things that we dealt with was we looked at the passages on the vision of God, and focusing first on the book of Revelation and its and this first major vision, which is chapters 4 and 5, that John was taken up by the Spirit on the Lord's Day on Sunday morning, in other words, at liturgy, most likely. And he saw through the material liturgy to its typological archetype. In other words, to its to the original, to the eschatological reality of the eternal liturgy of the kingdom of heaven. And, you know, throughout the prophets, we have a similar vision. And also, actually, back into Exodus. It's the same vision of God. So, which basically says that the prophets were on the same page. And all across history, because the material that's in Genesis, for example, is very old. It wasn't assembled until much later, but the material in Genesis and Exodus in particular are very old. Isaiah is from around 700, 800 BC. Ezekiel is... watch the cord. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I smelled something good. So Isaiah, the first part of Isaiah is from like 800 BC. The second part of there's several parts to the prophecy of Isaiah. Thank you.
Everybody has? Yes?
We do.
Thank you.
Yeah. Prophet Ezekiel starts around 570 something, already into the exile. But he has memories of the first temple. But he also has, he also dates his book. If we understood the dating system better, it would help. But it's according to the reign of whatever king. So it talks about in the year King Uzziah died. Well, who knows what year King Uzziah died? You can date the text from there. Daniel is much later. Daniel is from like 200 BC. And then the book of Revelation from probably 30 or 40 BC.
AD.
Or 80, yeah. So the texts are from all these various periods, and the texts of the prophets were put together with all of this other scriptural material, fragments from the liturgical texts from the first temple, and the writings of the prophets and the Psalms and the wisdom literature, and eventually by 400 AD. You come up with something that's similar to this. But it's important to understand that the book has a history. It's not written as empirical history. It's written it's a liturgical book. So, for example, one of the theories of the scholars, which makes perfect sense, is that the narration in Genesis of how God made the heavens and the earth and the day by day that was part of what was read liturgically as the tabernacle was being assembled, because they would have to disassemble it and assemble it as they moved it in the wilderness. The tabernacle was the tent. It was a tent, essentially, like a Bedouin's tent. It also, the historicity of it, in our terms, probably gets more accurate the later it gets. And you can go to these places and you can find or the archaeologists can, still find evidence of, various aspects of the history that's in here. But then there are some things which are just gone. And one of those things that is gone is the first temple. But it's also important to remember that at the end of the first temple, right before it was obliterated in 586 BC, there was a radical reformation. And the whole theology and liturgical life of Israel changed. And then just a few years later, the building of the temple and all of its records were destroyed. So very little survives, except memories. And those memories became part of an oral tradition. Now, there were texts that survived, but it wasn't like there was a whole book of texts. These were random scrolls. And so the scriptures were put together, the scriptures of the Old Testament were put together when the Jews were carried off into exile by the Babylonians. But the ones who were carried off into exile by the Babylonians were the elite. They were the politically correct class. And being the politically correct class, they were the ones who had embraced this radical reform. It was a theological reform, a liturgical reform, and I'll get into the content. So when they were in the exile, they realized, basically, that never again would things be like they were before the exile. And they were in exile for 70 years, which was basically one person's lifetime. So very few people who had gone into exile, at least as adults, would have come out of exile, would have returned to Jerusalem. So there was no kind of personal connection between the first temple and the second temple. There was only the stories. And there was only the memories that were transmitted. And then there were these random texts. Now, the texts were put together in a way that conveyed the message of the reform. They were edited to convey the message of the reform.
Why did they go to exile?
Why? Because they were in the way of the Babylonians, and they wanted them, and they wanted their land, and they wanted their stuff, and they wanted their gold, and they wanted to control the area, and so they
were stronger.
Much stronger.
Much stronger.
And so they had a war. They laid siege to Jerusalem. They destroyed large parts of it, and they carried off the elite. Yeah.
Are you saying that the reform happened before the exile or during exile? Before. So what prompted the reform itself?
That is a good question. Now, we will read all about that. Because it's actually really important to know, to hear this history from the source, right?
Can I just back you up just one
Yeah.
little bit? You'd mentioned in a previous class that the presence of God, the Ark of the Covenant, were lost or disappeared. And so at what point in time period did that happen?
Well, nobody's quite sure.
Okay.
So, anyway, you have. So before we get to this, just a quick review. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would be roughly 2000 BC. If you go by the strict kind of historical, or by a historiographic timeline, Moses would have been about 1600 BC. David would have been about 1000 BC. Moses received the revelation of God in the wilderness, and he led the people out of Egypt. He received the tablets of the law from God. As the meme says, he was probably the first to receive a download from the cloud on tablets.
It's better than a smartphone.
Yeah. And the tablets of the law were put into a box, that was specially created box, that was called the Ark of the Covenant. And on the Ark, it wasn't just a box, it was covered with gold, and it had 2 images of cherubim, which are like sphinxes with wings on each other, and the wings facing each other. And the lid of the Ark was called the mercy seat. And so there were other things from the time of Moses that were put in the Ark. There was Aaron's rod that budded, and a jar of manna from the angelic bread from the wilderness. And all of that stuff was inside the Ark as the testimony to God's faithfulness. And of course the tablets of the law were the terms of the covenant with God. The terms of the covenant basically were, I will be your God and you will be my people if you do these things. So, the Ark of the Covenant was housed in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a big tent in several parts. There was the inner tent, which had 2 distinct parts. There was the outer part, outer room, which was basically for the priests. And then there was the inner room, which was the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was. And there was a curtain made out of blue, red, and I think purple and white, with images of cherubim embroidered into it, which separated the Holy of Holies from the outer room. In that outer room, there was the table of the showbread. There was a small altar of incense, and there was the 7-branch candlestick. Now, there's another item that was in the Holy of Holies, and it was a throne. And there were not just the 2 cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant, there were 2 huge cherubim, which were like 15 feet high, surrounding the throne, with the wings spread over the throne, and it was the throne of the king. One of the problems, or one of the aspects of the text that reveals that it was severely edited is that there's a difference in the lists of what was in the Holy of Holies. And some of those absences are very telling. So, for example, in later Judaism, when the Holy of Holies was empty, there was also no king. So there was no throne in the Holy of Holies, just as there was also no Ark of the Covenant. There was no menorah, which was a symbol of the Tree of Life, which was also a symbol of wisdom, but we'll go there later. And it was and all of the sacred contents of the Ark of the Covenant were gone. So in the second temple, the Holy of Holies was empty. But in the tabernacle, and then in the first temple, which was conceived by David and built by his son Solomon, the Holy of Holies was fully furnished with the Ark of the Covenant, with the throne of the king, with the cherubim of glory, and it was, and the glory of the Lord would fill the house. It talks about that in Exodus, where it was the tabernacle, where even Moses couldn't stay in the Holy of Holies, much less any of the priests. And it talks about that in 2 Chronicles, where with the consecration of the temple, where the glory of the Lord filled the Holy of Holies. And basically, the only difference was the temple was built of wood and masonry instead of being a tent. But it was a glorious building. So with the first temple, it was established. David conceived the temple. He had Solomon build it, but there was a covenant between God and David that God would make sure, God would, if the people were faithful, would keep a king like David on the throne of Israel forever, and that his seed would reign forever. Now, we think of seed in a plural sense, but actually the word there is one seed. One seed. Not a general sense. And so it's a prophecy of the Messiah, who will reign forever. Okay, so Solomon consecrated the temple, and we can read all about that. We probably will.
Where are you?
Actually, there are. Well, I'm getting there. And so this is about 900 BC. There's a whole series of kings after David. In 722 BC, the northern kingdoms are carried off. I forget who by, I think the Assyrians. And so Israel is reduced to the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, I think. Anyway, it's mainly Judah is left. And the 10 lost tribes are gone. 580, around 600 BC, Josiah becomes the king, and he does a radical reform because he's convinced that the religion of Israel had become decadent. And they were rummaging around in the storage rooms of the temple and found some old manuscripts. Well, everything was a manuscript at that time. But they found some old books. And so he had these books read out in the hearing of the people. Of course, there's a question as to exactly how old they were, since they were the books that created a radical reform. Because at that time, many things changed. However, in just a couple of years, around 596, the Babylonians came through and sacked Jerusalem, including the temple. And then it was another 10 years later, they came through and they carried off all of the elite. All the, and so Israel, as it had been known, was gone. The temple, as it had been known, was burned, and the stones dispersed. So there was nothing left.
Excuse me, but I can't see. Babylonian is what territory as we are now?
Iraq.
It's just Iraq.
It's in Iraq, the Babylonian Empire.
That's it. That's not a big empire.
It was a big empire. There were like 3 major empires that were kind of in competition for that territory. There were the Babylonians, who were also Assyrian, and there were the Egyptians, and it's only later, another 300 years later, you have Alexander the Great coming in, and then 200 years later you have the Romans.
And then you have the Arabs.
So it's really a story of, the story of Israel is the story of which empire is conquering it now, and to whom are they vassals now. So that's a big issue. Anyway, so during this reform, one of the things that happens is that Josiah went through and he had everything, and he removed everything in the temple that he thought was not strictly focused on God. And one of the things that was very important in the temple, up to that time, liturgically, as well as theologically, were various kinds of images and actually furniture in the Holy of Holies that was associated with wisdom. Now, wisdom is a major figure in the Old Testament. Wisdom is a feminine figure. The word wisdom in Hebrew as well as in Greek is a feminine word. And wisdom was sometimes referred to as the mother of the Lord. In Hebrew, it was called Asherah. or Asherta. And there was a whole party among the Israelites that rejected, led by the king, that rejected the veneration of wisdom of Asherta, and so they purged the temple of the images, which were goddess images. They took out the menorah, which was not the big 7-branch candlestick. Those were basically, there were 7 of those that stood in the courtyard of the temple, and were basically lights. They provided light. They were candlesticks, or lamps. But the one that was inside the sanctuary, was in the form of an almond tree, and the tree was the image of a tree was associated with wisdom. Another thing that they did was they chopped down sacred groves of trees. The groves of trees were associated with wisdom. And so there are various passages, and we'll go through and look at some of this material later, still in the Old Testament, which are the lamentations of the people of being deprived of wisdom. Now, all of this happened shortly before the Babylonians swept in and destroyed the temple. So the people kind of rather naturally made a connection that God did not like these reforms. However, they were not the ones in charge of writing the Old Testament. The ones in charge are the ones who wrote the Old Testament and assembled all of this rescued material from before the temple was destroyed and took it with them into exile, were the ones who followed the reforms of Josiah. Now, there's another aspect that's really, really important here, is the theological aspect. The understanding of who God is. In Genesis, in the story of the creation, in the story of Melchizedek, in the stories about Abraham, other stories about Abraham, God is identified as God Most High. Then there is Yahweh. And these are distinct. Then there's wisdom, otherwise known as the Holy Spirit. And the teaching of the understanding of the religion of the patriarchs, which was basically the understanding of the religion of the First Temple, was that God was a unity. Even what did they call it, the Shahada? No, that's maybe Islam. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one, right? Actually, what it says is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is a unity. It's a union of multiples. Just like we, as Christians, believing in the Trinity, we can say our Lord is one Lord, right? Well, in other words, it's called henotheism. There's a multiplicity of persons, but a unity of being. So there's one God with multiple persons. For us, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And of course, in Christianity, we've taken and developed that philosophically very highly. It wasn't as philosophically or theologically developed in the First Temple, but it was certainly part of the faith of the people, and that's why one of the reasons why you have so much material, especially in the wisdom literature, in the Psalms, and in the prophets, in particular in Isaiah, about the importance of wisdom and the lamentation that wisdom has been exiled, and that the results of that exile are a disaster for Israel.
Because in the prayer, the Shema, it ends, the Lord is, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is Ehad, one. They use the word one, which is also the number one, or one thing.
But does it refer to a unity, or does it refer?
It just means one.
I think in the Greek it's enos,
Which is,
instead of monos.
oh, but maybe in the First Temple it was different.
You said unity of what? You said
Unity of persons.
No, you said no.
Like,
Multiplicity.
as in the Trinity, 3 persons who are one God, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Same thing in First Temple.
So multiplicity of what?
Multiplicity of persons, as it were, in
and
the Godhead.
unity?
Of essence.
Essence.
One essence, yeah. I mean, but that's much later. That's 4th century.
That's what you said.
Yeah, it's much later. It's 4th century. That's reading back our development of it theologically and philosophically. It wasn't developed. At least we don't know. We don't have any text.
It's interesting how in Genesis it starts off, let us make man in our image.
Yeah.
Myself and I.
And Elohim is plural.
Means God. So. But they think it could have also been the name of the God too, or name of gods. So
Yeah, Anyways, it was a very different idea than what was expounded by Josiah in his reforms. Was that God was a solitary unity. In other words, one instead of one. Or maybe one, as we all know what that means.
This tradition of wisdom being the Holy Spirit and the throne representing the Messiah.
Well, it was the throne of the king, because the king was the Messiah. He was the anointed one.
Oh, but there's the prophecy of the...
Well, yeah, there's the, and I'll get into all of that, because there's the Messiah, who's the eschatological archetype of kingship, who is prophet, priest, and king. And then you have the king who rules in the midst of his people, who is also prophet and who is also priest. Yeah.
You said that they called Asherah, or the spirit of wisdom, or the mother of the Lord, but you also said that it's known as the Holy Spirit as well. Are those two separate things? Or are they?
No, it's all one thing, just different names for the same thing.
Does that correlate to the Theotokos at all? Because that sounds kind of like what the Muslims believe that we believe, and that's like that might be where it originates from. I don't know.
Well, here again, you got to look at it typologically. The Theotokos is, in a sense, an almost eschatological archetype of wisdom, or the wisdom is the ultimate eschatological divine or semi-divine archetype. And there's a shift there, because in Christianity, was a lot of, at least our Christianity was worked out in Greek, right? You have Christ, who is the wisdom, word, and power of God, who is Yahweh. But what was going on in the Josianic reforms was there was a confusion between the literally a confusion, a fusing together of God Almighty and Yahweh, and a loss of the sense of their distinction, a loss in the sense of the sonship of Yahweh to the Father, to God Almighty, and certainly a loss of the the idea of the relationship between Yahweh and wisdom, or the Holy Spirit. And it's there in the Psalms. I'll go more into this, but not right in this. Okay? Mm-hmm. So there was this radical reform. Somewhere.
What was the religion of the Babylonian?
Paganism.
Paganism.
Was this reform within the Hebrews themselves?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. Fourth Kings. Okay. So Josiah's reform included not just this theological reform, a change in the idea of God, but there was a radical change in the idea of liturgically. Previously, the most important feast for Israel was the Day of Atonement, in which the high priest would sacrifice. There were bulls that were sacrificed, and then there were 2 goats. One called the Lord, and the other called Azazel, or one for the Lord and one for Azazel, which is a kind of, but that really doesn't work. It's more like one that was symbolic of, or a type of the Lord, and the other was a type of Azazel, Azazel being a demon, essentially. The high priest would lay its hands on the goat for Azazel, and would symbolically lay all of the sins of Israel on the goat for Azazel, or the goat Azazel, and it would be driven off into the wilderness to be killed. But the goat for the Lord was taken, and when it was sacrificed, it was slaughtered, and its blood was taken by the high priest into the Holy of Holies. it would be, and the priest would offer the blood. Some of it would be poured or sprinkled on the Ark of the Covenant and whatever was in the Holy of Holies, and then it would be sprinkled on the temple. And I would imagine it also earlier at some point. It would be sprinkled on the people. Just like Moses had sprinkled the blood of the covenant that was used to conclude the covenant of the Ten Commandments on the people of Israel in the wilderness. Because that was, and the idea is that the blood became a bearer of holiness, and it would restore the whole, and it would make holy whatever it touched, whatever it was sprinkled. It's like we do with holy water. Okay, so we don't sprinkle blood, we sprinkle holy water. Instead, we drink blood, the blood of Christ in the Eucharist, but we don't sprinkle with it. Now, up until this, so the Day of Atonement was, was the most important liturgical day in the calendar of Israel. Everybody would come to Jerusalem, and it would be done by the king. Because at that time there were no high priests. And this is another important indication that there was a radical change between the time of the first temple and the time of the second temple. There were Levites in the first temple, but there were no high priests other than the king. And so the whole Aaronic priesthood thing is second temple, not first temple. And one of the scholars posits that Melchizedek was an image of the priesthood of the first temple, because he made sacrifice for Abraham. When he offered bread and wine for Abraham, it wasn't just an act of hospitality, here, have a snack. It was an offering to God that then would have been shared with Abraham as a blessing, and those who were with him, to sanctify him. It's a big difference between making an offering of bread and wine and making an offering of an animal. And one of the things that was very important in the first temple was the table of the showbread, which bore an equal holiness to the Ark of the Covenant. And the showbread was put out there every Sabbath. It would sit for a week in the temple, in the holy place, and then be eaten by the priests as a means of communion, as a means of sanctification. The table of the showbread disappeared when the temple was destroyed. So I don't know if they reinstituted that in the second temple or not. But one of the major sacrifices of the first temple was bread and wine. Now, there was another major feast. There were three major feasts. The culmination of the fall festival was the Day of Atonement, but in the spring there was the Passover, And then there was Pentecost, and then tabernacles rolled into. I'm correct in that, right?
Yeah.
Tabernacles, which was the memory of the time in the desert, rolled into the feast of the Day of Atonement. They're kind of grouped festivals. Passover was a family festival. It didn't demand a priest to do the sacrifices. A lamb or a goat was killed and roasted, and the family would gather and would eat the meal, and would have to eat the whole lamb without any leftovers that on that night. And so it was, it was basically a family celebration in remembrance of the Exodus. That was, and those are the directions in Exodus. Now, under Josiah, there is a whole different sense to the concept of Passover. Passover becomes the primary festival of the year, and Day of Atonement is not even listed in the book of Deuteronomy among the festivals of Israel. That's a pretty radical change. Somehow the meaning of Passover, I would assume, I don't know, but I would assume, because certainly in Christianity, the Passover and the Atonement are linked. Mm-hmm. But I would bet it was in Judaism as well. After the Reform, and so the Passover became this major celebration where everybody would go to Jerusalem, and it was a big liturgical celebration of the whole nation. And so you can read all about that when you read about the Josianic Reform. And so it's a radical. It was a very great change in how Israel led its liturgical life. Now this didn't last very long, because of the Babylonians. They came through and they sacked everything, and then eventually carried off the elite. So what was left is the simple people in Israel, the simple people in Judah, the farmers and the shepherds and probably some of the merchants, and just the simple people, because these people wouldn't have been interesting to the Babylonians. They wanted the upper classes. They wanted the people who were wealthy, who were educated, who were more cosmopolitan. The elite who controlled the clans and the resources. And they were gone for about 70 years. And when they came back, what they came back with is Judaism. Now, up until the return from exile, Judaism is not mentioned in the Old Testament. It's the name of the religion that the exiles brought back with them from Babylon.
Was this a response to the Reform? Somewhat?
Well, it's a development of the Reform. The Reform actually prepared Israel, or prepared the people of Israel. It was a for the radical changes that were going to happen, which enabled it to survive. Mm-hmm. because in the exile and, I mean, whatever happened in the Reform, and then, we don't know exactly what happened in the Reform. We've got what's in the text, but the text was written by people after the exile. It's not like a newspaper that's being, recorded. It was written by people, probably 100 or more years later, and so they probably wrote back into the text, contemporary practices that they'd gotten out of the exile, because they had no problem with writing all sorts of things into the text, as a matter of fact. So when they came back, in regards to the temple, well, the temple had to be rebuilt. They had an expense account from the king of Babylon to do that, because they were now his loyal vassals. And then there were the when they did, then there was Ezra, who oversaw the reconstruction of the temple and the reconstruction of the scriptures, or the writing of the scriptures. But what it evolved in Babylon was the whole institution of rabbis who would meet together with the faithful in synagogues, and who would study the stories and who would study the scriptures, because the scriptures began to be composed in Babylon. But then they also began to be commented on, and that's what you call the Babylonian Talmud. Or that was the beginning of it.
So who converted who? The Babylonian, the Hebrew, or the Hebrew, the Babylonian?
Neither one. The Hebrews lived as a minority in exile in Babylon.
But still they had an important role.
Yeah, they had a very important role. They didn't always get along with the king, but the king certainly respected them so as not to obliterate them.
Yeah, actually, you just said he helped to build the second temple.
Yeah, he did.
Why would he do that if he is not Hebrew?
Reparations? Who knows?
Come
I don't know about the politics. I'm not sure about the politics of that.
That's curious.
Well, but what would that do? It would secure them as his vassals, so that they wouldn't make friends with the Egyptians or whoever the enemy was at that moment.
Why is the U.S. helping Israel out right now?
And Saudi Arabia, which up until a few years ago were mortal enemies. Yeah, it's politics. So, lest it get too late. Okay, just somebody like to read. Let's see, Fourth Kings, Fourth Kingdoms.
I never read Fourth Kings.
Oh.
I read only First and Second Kings.
Mm-hmm. So this is Fourth Kings. Chapter 22 is Josiah becomes the king of Judah. Well, I'll start out. This is verse starting with 3. Now in the 18th year of King Josiah, in the 8th month, the king sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, the scribe of the house of the Lord, saying, Go up to Hilkiah and the high priest, and take account of the money brought into the house of the Lord gathered from the people. And let them deliver it into the hand of the appointed workers in the house of the Lord. So he gave it to those in the house of the Lord doing the work to repair the damages of the house, to the carpenters and builders and masons to acquire wood and hewn stones, to strengthen the repairs of the house. However, because they dealt faithfully, they were not asked to account for the money delivered into their hands. So this was, I think this is probably after the first sacking of the temple, my guess. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I discovered the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. Then he brought the book to King Josiah and turned to the king to report, saying, Your servants have melted down the silver being found in the house of the Lord, and given it to the ones having responsibility for the repairs to the house of the Lord. So Shaphan the scribe spoke to the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest gave me a book, and Shaphan read it before the king. Now when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam the son of Shaphan, Achbor the son of Micaiah, Shaphan the scribe, and Asaiah the servant of the king, saying, Go and inquire of the Lord for me, for all the people, and for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that was found. For great is the wrath of the Lord kindled against us, because our fathers did not hear and obey the words of this book, to do according to all the words of this book written concerning us. Anyway, so it goes on. 23. Now the king sent and gathered to himself all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord with all the men of Judah, and with him all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, both small and great. He read all the words of the book of the covenant discovered in the house of the Lord for them to hear. Then the king stood by a pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to follow the Lord and to keep his testimonies and commandments and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to conform to the words of this covenant written in the book. And all the people took a stand for the covenant. So the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order, and those who had charge of the weights, to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and for the sacred wooden image and for all the hosts of heaven. Then he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. Now, the hosts of heaven, that means angels. And he put an end to the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense in the high places, in the cities of Judah and in all the places all around Jerusalem. This included those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, and to all the hosts of heaven. Then he took the wooden image from the house of the Lord to the brook Kidron outside Jerusalem. The wooden image would have been the Asherah, the image of wisdom. He burned it at the brook Kidron and ground it to ashes. He threw its ashes on the graves of the sons of the people. So in the house of the Lord he tore down the ritual booths of the male temple prostitutes, the place where the women wove linen garments for the wooden image. And then he led up all the priests from the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests burned incense, from Geba to Beersheba. And he pulled down the house of the gate by the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which was left to the left of the city gate. Only the priests of the high places did not come up to the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, for they only ate leavened bread among their brethren. He defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and so no man might make his son or daughter pass through the fire as an offering to Molech. Then he removed the horses the kings of Judah dedicated to the sun at the entrance to the house of the Lord, by the offering box of Nathan the king's eunuch in the court. He burned the chariot of the sun with fire. As for the altars made by the kings of Judah on the roof of the upper chamber of Ahaz, and the altars Manasseh made in the two courts of the house of the Lord, the king pulled them down and removed them by force. He cast their dust into the brook Kidron. Then the king defiled the house east of Jerusalem on the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, and for Milcom, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he broke in pieces the sacred pillars, and he cut down the sacred wooden images, and filled their places with human bones. As for the altar at Bethel, the high altar which Jeroboam the son of Nebat had made, who led Israel to sin, that altar and that high place he tore down and crushed the stones. He ground them into dust and burned the wooden image. As Josiah turned, he saw the tombs on the mountain there in the city. So he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar. He defiled it according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God had spoken when Jeroboam stood at the altar during the festival. And he turned and raised his eyes to the tomb of the man of God who spoke these words. And he said, "What gravestone is this that I see?" So the men of the city told him, "It is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and proclaimed these things you did against the altar of Bethel." Then he said, "Leave him alone. Let no one move his bones." So his bones were saved along with the bones of the prophet who came from Samaria. Now Josiah also took away all the shrines of the high places, the ones the kings of Israel made in the cities of Samaria, and provoked the Lord to anger. And he did to them as he had done in Bethel. He put to death all the priests of the high places on the altars, and burned human bones on them, and returned to Jerusalem. King Josiah commanded all the people, saying, "Keep the Passover to the Lord our God, as it is written in the book of the covenant." Such a Passover had not been held since the days of the judges, who judged Israel, not all in the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, but in the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was held to the Lord in Jerusalem. So Josiah put away those who consulted mediums and wizards, the household gods and idols, and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem. He did so that he might perform the words of the law, which were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. There was no king like him who arose after him. Yet the Lord did not turn away from the fierceness of his great wrath aroused against Judah, for all the provocations of Manasseh had provoked him. So the Lord said, "I shall remove Judah from my sight as I removed Israel. I shall reject this city, Jerusalem, which I chose, and the house where I said, my name shall be there." Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and everything he did, are these not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? In his days Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, went to the aid of the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went against him. And Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo when he confronted him. Then his servants moved his body in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz the son of Josiah, anointed him, and made him king in his father's place.
So he was killed.
So he was killed. So, can you imagine the radicalness of that reform? It would have been like going from Russian Orthodox to Jehovah's Witness on multiple levels.
Wow.
So the author is saying that there were Josiah in part was claiming that there were false gods of the pagans being practiced or followed in not just the temple but in the various other temples that people had in their homes. But I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, and this is one of the big questions.
But if they were, they shouldn't have been doing that.
Right, exactly. But was it also, I think the question is, was it also a rejection of the multi-personal concept of God, the rejection of wisdom in particular, and the rejection of the distinction between God Most High and Yahweh?
It seems to me to be almost identical to this reductionary spirit of Protestantism you see in the modern day. In fact, like it reminds me a lot of like the way that they sort of see like because it mentions specifically in that text the the time of the judges, and they see that as like the glory days,
Right.
before the Davidic kingship, and the Protestants see that they read that text and they believe the same thing. They basically think that the kings were bad, like even if they were good kings, it was still just like kind of God's provision for men rather than like like ordained holy order. That was all I had to say.
Yeah, ultimately, we have these accounts, and there's a parallel account in the book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, or 1 Chronicles maybe. But from a historiographic kind of imperial historiography, we don't have. And these texts were written by people who favored Josiah's reforms. And obviously Josiah is a great hero. Because if you look at the book of Chronicles, almost all the other kings, there's a formula. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he died and was buried with his fathers. And so you've got that for like 200 kings. And then you have Josiah. And so but this was all written by those who won and who resisted the kings. But never again would there actually be a Davidic king in Israel until the Messiah.
What was the text that you just read?
That was 4th Kingdoms 22, 23.
I don't even have that in my Bible.
What else is it called? 4th King?
2 Kings.
That's 2 Kings?
2 Kings.
Okay.
Yeah, this 4th Kingdoms is the Septuagint name for it. Okay, so does this all kind of make sense? So, what happened with this? So the exile happened. The exiles returned. They had to they rebuilt the temple. Of course, all that was in the temple could not be replaced, and so the Holy of Holies was empty. And it came to be understood that only the Messiah would restore the ark, would restore the myrrh, the chrism, and ultimately only with the Messiah would there be the return of the Spirit to the temple. In the meantime, all the genealogical records had been destroyed, so they couldn't tell who was the son of Levi, who was the son of Aaron with any assurance. But one of the things that's kind of interesting, let's go to 2 Chronicles. Chapter 8. Well, okay, let's... chapter 8, verse 11. Now Solomon brought the daughter of Pharaoh up from the city of David to the house he built for her. For he said, My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the place where the ark of the Lord has come is holy. Then Solomon offered burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of the Lord he built before the temple, according to the daily rate, offering according to the commandment of Moses for the Sabbaths, the new moons, and the 3 appointed yearly feasts, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. According to the order of David his father, he appointed the divisions... Listen to this. According to the order of David his father, he appointed the divisions of the priests for their service, the Levites for their duties, to praise and serve before the priests, as each day's duty required, and he appointed the gatekeepers by their divisions at each gate, for so David the man of God commanded. Concerning any matter or the treasuries, they did not depart from the command of the king to the priests and Levites. Now all the work of Solomon was well ordered, from the day of the foundation until Solomon finished the house of the Lord. What's missing?
The Day of Atonement.
Well, that's missing.
Oh.
That is missing. What else is missing?
Passover.
The priests of Aaron, the high priest. And who's offering sacrifice? It says in the text.
Solomon.
Solomon, the king, is offering sacrifice. The king was the high priest, or was functioning as the high priest. There probably was a chief priest, undoubtedly, but an Aaronic high priest is something different. So in the first temple, one of the big distinctions was that you didn't have, at least according to in the texts, you didn't have this highly developed high priesthood of Aaron that you find in the law of Moses. That was the governing law of the Second Temple. That's a big deal. It's a big deal. So back to, I think it's 1 Kings 8:57, or 1 Kings 8:53. Another example is Solomon blesses the people. When Solomon finished praying all his prayer and supplication to the Lord, he rose up from before the altar of the Lord, and after kneeling on his knees with his hands spread up to heaven, then he stood and blessed the whole assembly of Israel with a loud voice, and said, Blessed be the Lord this day, who gave rest to the people, to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all his good words he spoke through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he not leave us nor forsake us, that he may incline our hearts to himself, to walk in all of his commandments. And his statutes that he commanded our fathers. May these words with which I have made supplication before the Lord stand near the Lord our God day and night, to maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel, as each day may require, that all the peoples of the earth may know the Lord is God, and there is no other. Let your heart therefore be perfect to the Lord our God, that you walk piously in his statutes and keep his commandments as today. Then the king and all the children of Israel offered sacrifices before the Lord. King Solomon made a sacrifice of peace offerings and offered it to the Lord, 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. So the king, that was quite a barbecue.
People did the thing.
So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. On that day the king consecrated the middle of the court that was in front of the house of the Lord. There he offered burnt offerings, grain offerings, and the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar before the Lord was too small to receive the burnt offerings and the peace offerings. On that day Solomon made a feast, and all Israel was with him, a great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the river of Egypt, before the Lord our God, in the house he built, eating, drinking, and rejoicing before the Lord our God for 7 days. On the 8th day he sent the people away and blessed each of them. Each one went to his tent joyfully and with a good heart for all the good the Lord did for his servant David and for Israel his people.
It starts out by saying it's a memorial to the day of rest. So this must have occurred on the Sabbath, which is along with the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement would be considered more holy, but right there with it, or right close, is the Sabbath. Which, so with the narrative of what occurred to me when you were teaching earlier, what merged too was the Sabbath was like talked about there, the memorial to the creation and to what God did for Israel. But then they brought in Exodus later, and gave the Sabbath that additional meaning.
And then there's another aspect too, and an aspect of the Reform. Before the Reform, Israel used a solar calendar, and so the Sabbath was always on, obviously the Sabbath was always on Saturday, but Passover was always on a fixed day.
Oh, right, the lunar calendar shifts.
And whereas the lunar calendar, it shifts.
Right.
And when did they switch calendar?
With the Reform of Josiah. So they're old calendarists and they're new calendarists.
Wait a second, so the first one was the solar calendar.
Right.
And then it became lunar. It's unusual nowadays.
So what's now in Judaism is the lunar calendar. Though obviously they function on the solar calendar, which is the Roman calendar, which is what we use.
You have two solar calendars.
Let's see. So what are the temple, just before, all of Israel's life of Israel was focused on the temple before the exile. After the exile, the temple, it took time to rebuild the temple, but the religious life of the people was divided. There were the temple feasts, and there was an ongoing liturgy of sacrifice in the temple. But the religious life of the people began to be focused on going to the synagogue and studying the Torah. There were rabbis instead of priests. Priests offer sacrifice. A rabbi is a scholar and interprets the text. And there's a huge difference between a priest and a rabbi. It's the difference between a Protestant minister and an Orthodox or Catholic priest. They're similar, both are ministers, but the ministries are totally different. And this model actually was a very positive adaptation that allowed Judaism to survive. because the temple would eventually be destroyed. The second temple would eventually be destroyed in the year 70. And Jesus was a prophet of the destruction of the second temple, among other things. Just read what he said. He talks about how not one stone will be left upon the other. So Judaism, or the Hebrew religion, bifurcated into Judaism, which my guess is remained probably the religion of the ruling classes, and then the simple Hebrew people, the Israelite people, who retained the cultural memory and the faith of the first temple. Jesus came from the latter. He came from the simple people. He was a carpenter. Joseph was a carpenter. They had temple connections. Obviously, Mary, who was raised in the temple, but Jesus would have been raised in, was raised in Nazareth, in the house of Joseph, where there were simple people. He would have gone to the synagogue, but that doesn't mean that he was necessarily a Jew, and he never identified himself as a Jew in the New Testament. And his preaching was, if you look in particular about the Gospel of John, is about the differentiation between the Father and the Son, and that he, as the Son of God, the God Yahweh, the God of Israel, has come to reveal God the Father to his people, and that it is to the Father and to direct all prayer and all worship to the Father. And we'll get into that.
So he got his title King of the Jews from
Herod, or from Pilate.
Pilate.
Who was a Roman.
But he went to the temple. Jesus was...
He would go to the temple, yeah.
He observed the Jewish tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, he observed the national traditions of his people, but he wasn't fanatical about them, and he certainly reproved those who were. So he constantly upbraided the Pharisees for their hypocrisy.
So he upheld the Jewish traditions or the Hebrew traditions?
Well, both. I mean, they merged. They merged. Because Judaism is a religion of the Hebrew people.
Yeah.
But, and in that context, all Jews were Hebrews, but not all Hebrews were Jews.
Right.
And there were some Hebrews who would have been excluded from going to the temple. He obviously wasn't.
The Essenes?
I don't know if they were excluded or whether they just refrained. In their monastic community at Qumran, they would never have set foot in the temple because they didn't believe in it. They believed it was totally corrupt. And certainly Jesus also showed that while he would honor the temple, he believed that it was deeply corrupt. Otherwise, what was he doing? You can't interpret his preaching any other way.
Right.
It's very clear. So it kind of contextualizes things. Now, the fathers of the church were not interested in these questions, and they don't address it at all, that I know of. They're much more interested in other ways of interpreting the scriptures. But here again, to the extent as Americans that we're interested in history, we're interested in empirical historiography as opposed to a more kind of synthetic approach to history. So we get caught in the details. So does this make sense? Allie, did this come close to answering your question?
Very helpful, thank you.
Okay.
Very much. Helped tremendously.
Okay.
It took us away from the revelation.
No, because all of this is very important.
It is.
This is foundation. This is foundational to understanding the Book of Revelation, because the Book of Revelation is partly about a visions of the temple, but it's the temple of heaven. In other words, it's the eschatological archetype, but it has all of the elements that of the temple, not of the second temple, but of the first temple. And so it has the ark, it has the menorah, it has the chrism, it has all of these things that were supposed to be in the temple, but weren't in the second, but did not exist in the second temple.
So it doesn't make sense to even thinking about the third temple.
Well, the Jews are very, very avidly thinking of it. Some Jews, not all by any means, but there are many people who are very involved, and a lot of ill-advised evangelicals who are thinking about a third temple.
Which will be what? Because we know the difference between the first and the second. What do they think about the third one?
Well, they think they're going to recreate the Ark of the Covenant, I'm sure. But they can't. How do you recreate the Ark of the Covenant when what made the Ark holy were the tablets of the law, and those are long gone?
Right. I think the evangelicals only want it to happen so that the world will end sooner.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
everybody says that every century.
So the rapture will happen.
Yeah, so the rapture will happen.
But I'm afraid there's no rapture going to happen. And
we'll tell them that.
Yeah.
So
I get this question all the time: are you pre-trib or post-trib, or what? And I'm like, what? Like, what is the rapture? What do you mean?
We're amillennial post-trib.
can you tie together the fact that Revelation is not mentioned or taught, but yet it seems to me that the liturgy is just a manifestation of all of that.
It is.
But it seems like a paradox in a way.
Revelation.
You know what I'm saying? Is it?
Well, there's always been a distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric teaching of the church. There's always been a hidden teaching. There's always been and in other words, you have that, coming from Jesus through to the apostles, the whole oral tradition that was never written down until much later. And then you have the distinction later between the dogma and the kerygma, that which is preached, the kerygma, and the dogma, which is the inner vision of the church. And it's only so. For example, the preaching of the church, according to St. Paul, is Jesus Christ and Him crucified, right? So that's what we preach. But for when you're within the church, when you're within You're not only, it's not just about the preaching of the church, it's about this living vision that's imparted by the grace of the Holy Spirit through the sacraments. And so you get to know the saints, you get to know the Mother of God, you get to know, in a different way than you did before you were baptized. And so to enter into the dogmatic consciousness of the church, it's not about some kind of Gnostic secret texts and things like that. It's about a depth of understanding and on a much deeper level than is possible outside of the sacramental context of the life of the church. And so Revelation is essentially, the book of Revelation is reserved, as it were, to that sphere of people who have that deeper, mature understanding, because it's too complex for the uninitiated. So, and if we were, when the scriptures were put together, no one would have dreamed that you could go down to the corner store and buy a copy of the Bible. No one would have. They would have thought you're crazy, because it all had to be copied by hand. A complete set of the scriptures would have been the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and who would have had that? And so, some of the great cathedrals would have full Bibles. Most of them didn't. It took centuries for that to happen. And then it took the printing press. But with the printing press, there's all the, everything was printed with no discrimination as to what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. So.
Out of context.
It's out of context. Because what is the context for the scriptures?
Tradition.
Well, it's the tradition. It's the life of the church. So, what's the proper place of the scriptures? The Gospels belong in the center of the altar, right? That's the context of the Gospels, and that means that ultimately you can only truly understand how the Gospels were intended to be read by the liturgical context. Because the Gospels are an icon and graphic icon of Christ. Same thing, the Old Testament. It has a very specific context. Nobody ever dreamed that people would be sitting on their back porch and studying a floppy Bible. So, so there's a whole cultural development, that was unforeseeable, actually.
Was there very little study then just for the sake of study? It was more liturgy. Worship was the purpose.
Liturgy was the primary purpose. There was a few who did study, for, especially clergy for the sake of preaching, and especially bishops, because not even all priests could read very well. Most of the priests could read enough to get through the service, but that doesn't mean that they, could read well.
As laymen, how should we approach the Bible?
Well, you pray it first. You pray it in church, and you pray it as you read it at home, and then you study it. It's fine to study. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying anything against studying the Bible, but it was just unthinkable when it was you know, the first 1,600 years of its 1,500 years of its existence. So, okay. So, this is definitely not a fundamentalist approach to the scriptures.
We have a lot of cultural hubris. And we think that we can figure out everything for ourselves.
Yep. Yeah, it is pretty wild. So, shall we pray? It is truly meet to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption, that gave his birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify them. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and to ages of ages.
Amen.
Amen.